When Ben Shapiro says things like,
once you remove all of the money from the rich people who are saving all their money and give it to all the poor people to buy hamburgers, that doesn't help the economy or spur the economy.
Or when Donald Trump cut taxes for corporations and the wealthiest Americans and said,
this is going to be one of the great gifts to the middle-income people of this country.
They're actually just plagiarizing one of the most influential right-wing thinkers of the last century. In fact, he might be the most influential right-wing thinker. The Cato Institute calls him the greatest champion of liberty. The Heritage Foundation says he was the father of economic freedom. Arnold Schwarzenegger even said his work
changed my life.
His policies were adopted by the right wing and put into action by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The results were so good for wealthy Americans that they were carried on by every single president after. We've basically had the same president in America since 1982. Yes, that includes the black one. Just keeping it a buck. I'm FD Signifier. This is the Classroom for More Perfect Union, and today we're talking about Milton Friedman, the man who broke economics. Oh man, are my Crocs in the shot? Oh God, don't show that I'm wearing Crocs. Or do, whatever, it's fine. It makes me relatable maybe, I don't know. In 1980, the economist Milton Friedman was asked to produce a series for PBS about laissez-faire economics called Free to Choose, a high-budget 10-part series with Friedman traveling the world, visiting sweatshops in New York and Hong Kong, and dropping in on welfare recipients and public housing residents in Manchester and the Bronx. That's gross. When Friedman was asked to host Free to Choose, he was a well-known economist and had won the Nobel Prize, but his ideas were considered radical, if not downright weird. He believed that the government shouldn't regulate pharmaceuticals and that the post office should be abolished. He thought all drugs should be legal, the military draft illegal. He loved freedom so much, he argued that medical licenses should be abolished and replaced with private enterprise.
Why should medical care be a monopoly of licensed physicians?
Imagine letting the free market control whether you live or die. You don't actually have to imagine it. It's what we're doing right now. He won. In the first episode, The Power of the Market, Friedman goes to a garment factory in New York and talks about how his own mother arrived in the city at age 14 and was able to get a job in one of these factories.
This is exactly the same kind of a factory that my mother worked in when she came to this country for the first time at the age of 14, almost 90 years ago.
It's not totally clear to me if Milton is saying that his mom got this job in the 1890s at age 14 when garment factory workers were mostly teenage girls who couldn't speak English, and they sometimes locked the factory doors to keep them from leaving. But either way, Friedman is definitely excited about it. His main point is that America, because of all its regulations, had gone soft and lost its former economic glory. Here is the thing you need to understand. In the 1980s, the United States had just experienced an international oil embargo, record inflation, and was entering a deep recession. Things were going bad. But before that, from the end of World War II to the 1980s, middle-class Americans were doing better than basically anyone had done in the history of the world. Middle-class Americans held 68% of the country's wealth. That sounds fucking amazing. If only not for the racism of the time. This era is what economists call the Great Compression. For 40 years in America, the gap between the richest and poorest shrunk significantly, and most people were considered middle class. There was a simple reason for this: taxes, loads and loads of taxes on the rich. This started under Theodore Roosevelt, who decimated the enormous wealth that the 1% enjoyed during the Gilded Age, and continued under Franklin Roosevelt, who raised income taxes for the richest Americans to 63% in his first term and to 79% in his second term. The very richest were paying as much as 90%. Imagine that. The second thing to understand is that union power was strong. 1 in every 4 American workers was unionized, so workers were able to bargain for higher wages. Even if you weren't in a union during this period, unionized businesses near you would raise your wages as well. Union members also tend to vote, so there was a big block of Americans who would turn out to keep their wages fair and maintain rights for workers. Let's go back to Friedman. Each episode ends back at the University of Chicago, where leading intellectuals and policymakers of the time react. Friedman had come to work at the University of Chicago to be with other economists and legal scholars who were opposed to the dominant economic policy of the time. The school had Aaron Director and Robert Bork, who would reshape our antitrust laws during the Reagan administration, libertarian George Stigler, and most important, Friedrich Hayek, the author of The Road to Serfdom, a book that argued that all government planning inevitably led to totalitarianism. These economists were some of the first to really challenge John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of the early 20th century. So next, we're going to talk about some economic theory. I know this sounds boring, so just to keep you awake, we're going to soundtrack all of this section with some pounding EDM music. So you're welcome. Keynes was a British economist who wrote a book in 1936 that would shape economic policy in America, the United Kingdom, and most of Europe. It was after the Depression and much of the world economy had not recovered. The basic idea of Keynes's work was that capitalism was inherently volatile. There would always be booms and busts in the market. To combat this, the government could break up monopolies, spend money, and manipulate interest rates to keep unemployment low and money flowing into the economy. This was the principle behind many public works projects in the New Deal. The government would create demand whenever demand was low.
Now you're making a strong case for Keynesian economics.
Milton Friedman hated the New Deal, and he hated that government used welfare and public works to combat the Great Depression. Friedman thought there was only one resolution for the Depression: bail out the banks. This was called monetarism, the idea that government should control the supply of money and basically leave everything else to the market, and that printing and spending money would only cause more inflation. Sound familiar?
Milton Friedman tells you inflation only gets created in Washington.
Friedman was one of the first to compare government spending to household spending, that it was more responsible to tighten your belts and cut spending no matter the cost to working people. Keynesians, by which we mean every American president from Roosevelt to Nixon, believe that if you get money into the pockets of people when there's a recession, it will make their lives easier, stimulate the economy, and lower unemployment. Friedman, on the other hand, believed that there was a natural rate of unemployment that I bet you just so happened to include as many black and brown people as possible, and that the market would find the perfect balance between the wages that workers demanded with the price bosses were willing to pay. And he believed in supply side economics. If we lower taxes and do away with regulations, we'll get money into the pockets of the rich, who will invest in factories, create jobs, and just overall increase the freedom. It sounds so stupid. It sounds so stupid. Maybe if he saw what was happening today, he would feel differently. Maybe, is he still alive? Let's find out. We'll get to the end of the video. In the 1980s, freedom in America was easily contrasted with our Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union. Many in the Chicago school had escaped repressive regimes and were horrified by fascism in Europe and communism in Russia. Keynes's ideology was also shaped by his experiences in World War I and the rise of the Nazi Party, but he had come to a different conclusion. After Germany was defeated in World War I and before the Nazis took power, Keynes argued that Europe should strive for economic balance to prevent poverty, inflation, and political extremists from taking power. You know what? That's a good take. It's almost as if this guy was kind of based. Maybe the guy Keynes was as based as economists could get. I don't know. I'm not an economist. Ultimately, Milton Friedman and other members of the Chicago School of Economics didn't actually have a problem with authoritarianism. They willingly advised the bloody Chilean dictatorship under Pinochet, who wanted to rapidly overturn the socialist economy and institute extreme neoliberal policies. But Friedman does a neat trick in the show. Freedom becomes free to be without constraints. A business should be free from regulation, just like a corporation should be free from taxes, and just like a worker should be free from union dues. Friedman's ideas gained traction when he correctly predicted stagflation. In the 1970s, there was an oil embargo and prices were rising. Workers had unions, so they were able to get their wages to rise with the cost of living. This, Friedman claimed, caused inflation to spiral out of control. In his book, Capitalism and Freedom, Friedman wrote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." Monetarism and the other anti-government policies were a convenient solution that Friedman and the other University of Chicago thinkers had been developing and promoting, waiting for just the right crisis. Free to Choose happened to air right when Ronald Reagan was running his second presidential campaign in the Republican primaries. Reagan was a well-known and well-loved candidate, and he was already sold on Friedman's ideas.
His TV series was about choices, risks, freedom, equality, and making a better future for all of us.
As governor of California, Reagan's concerns were low taxes and eliminating government waste and bureaucracy. Government programs like Social Security, Medicaid, and programs from homeowners in America were actually still quite popular in 1980. However, certain social programs were not. In his book, Reaganland, Rick Perlstein wrote that Reagan appealed to voters who benefited from things like government-backed mortgages, but also felt that programs that benefited minorities had gone too far. Ronald Reagan understood that white Americans resented the progress made by the civil rights movement. When he ran for governor of California in 1966, he ran on repealing the state's Fair Housing Act and opposed both the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. This idea that the undeserving poor were receiving too many benefits was gaining popularity among suburban whites. This was the base that helped make Reagan president. It always comes back to white supremacy, y'all. When Reagan took power, he set out to radically reform tax policy in the economy. He reduced the tax rate on the wealthiest from 70% to 35%. He went after the unions. He appointed pro-Wall Street figures to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the National Labor Review Board. Friedman might have been right about one thing. A crisis can make people rethink the big policies that shape the world. The Depression ushered in decades of progressive taxes and a larger social safety net for Americans. The recession of the 1970s brought on decades of deregulation and low taxes on the rich. How will our current crisis of wealth inequality and rising debt for the working and middle class create policies that we actually want to see?
If your profits are abusive, then we're going to claw them back and we're going to give them back to people.
It's punishing people who produce things you don't like. It's the wokeism of the tax.
Tax reform must substantially increase the share of long-term revenues paid by big corporations.
I would like to see us cut taxes. I think in particular corporation tax.
Now is the time to demand that the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations stop paying their fair share of taxes.
Thanks for watching The Classroom. This video was based in part on Rick Perlstein's Reaganland and Paul Krugman's Conscience of a Liberal, as well as his 2007 obituary on Milton Friedman. Are there other American thinkers and ideologues you want to see us cover? Who is the pundit from history you'd love to hate the most? Comment below, and as always, like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this one. This has been FD Signifier. Thank you. Peace.